The white cane tapped twice against the polished marble of Water Tower Place, and a 4-year-old girl named Posy tugged at her mother's coat, whispering that the Christmas tree was as tall as the whole sky. Delaney Marsh couldn't see that tree. She couldn't see the glittering garlands, the 8 stories of golden light, or the crowd of holiday shoppers swirling around her like a river she had to cross by sound alone. At 28, she'd already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime. Her sight, her career as an emergency room nurse, a husband who walked out the day the doctors said the blindness was permanent. Now she counted every dollar twice, worked a medical hotline from a cramped Southside apartment, and brought her daughter here for one reason only. Because a little girl deserves to stand beneath something beautiful, even if her mother can only feel its warmth. What Delaney didn't know was that she'd just walked into the path of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Rourke Castellane was 37, and he wore his power like the charcoal suit, tailored to his shoulders, quiet, exact, and impossible to ignore. He'd built an empire on fear, buried his enemies without losing sleep, and trusted exactly no one, because the man who'd raised him had taught him that affection was a weakness other people exploited. He'd just finished a brutal meeting upstairs, his pulse still cold and steady, when a blind woman clutching a child stumbled straight into his chest. 6 of his men drew their weapons in a single breath. The sound of slides racking back echoed across the lobby like a verdict, and Delaney froze not because she could see the guns, but because she could smell the gun oil, hear the leather of holsters, feel the sudden wall of men ready to kill. She braced for the worst, pulling Posy behind her. But Rourke didn't push her away. He looked down at the woman trembling against him, then at the small girl peering up with a pair of pale gray eyes he recognized, eyes that belonged to the late benefactor, whose family he had spent years trying to track down. Something in his chest, some buried thing he thought had died long ago, cracked wide open. He raised one hand, and his men lowered their guns instantly. Then he leaned close, his lips nearly brushing Delaney's ear, and whispered a single word that made the entire lobby go silent. Marsh. It wasn't a threat. It was a name he'd been hunting across the whole city, the name of the one man who'd once saved his life, and a secret that powerful, ruthless people would kill to keep buried. Delaney's blood turned to ice. How could this stranger possibly know her name? Why did his voice sound less like a predator, and more like a man who'd just seen a ghost? She didn't know that her late father, a forensic pathologist, had left her something far more precious and far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She didn't know that the questions about the night she lost her sight were only just beginning, and she had no idea that the cruelest man in the city was about to become the only thing standing between her daughter and the people who wanted them both gone. If you love stories about hidden strength, second chances, and the kind of love that can soften even the hardest heart, do me a quick favor, hit that like button so more people can find this story. Share it with someone who believes broken people can still be saved. And subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, so you never miss a single chapter of these emotional, twist-filled journeys we make just for you. Now, let's go back to that crowded lobby, to the blind mother, the silent child, and the dangerous man who just whispered her name, and find out what happens next. The silence stretched for one more beat, and then Rourke's voice rang out, low and sharp, not needing to rise for every word to be heard clearly across the hall, ordering his men to stand down. Delaney heard the click and scrape of metal as the guns were lowered, heard the faint grind of leather soles against the stone floor as 6 shadowed figures stepped back at once, and she couldn't understand why the air that had been thick with the scent of death only moments before now seemed to loosen like a cord pulled slack. She was still holding Posy tightly against her chest, her heart pounding so wildly she thought the little girl could hear it too, while one trembling hand searched for the white cane that had flown somewhere across the cold stone beneath them. But before she could reach it, she heard the rustle of fabric, heard a large man bending down beside her, and then the cane was placed into her palm with a gentleness that didn't seem to belong at all to everything she had just sensed about this man. His scent reached her before his words did, a deep scent of wood and leather, touched with something cold and metallic she couldn't name, and beneath it all, something she could only describe as danger folded tightly into itself. "Take it," he said, his voice softer than she expected, and she flinched when his hand brushed the back of hers for only an instant before pulling away, as though even he wasn't accustomed to that kind of tenderness. Posy, who had been silent all this time with her face buried against her mother's neck, suddenly lifted her head and looked at the stranger with wide eyes, not crying, not afraid, and Delaney felt it in the way the child's tiny fingers stopped clutching so hard at her clothes. "I dropped my bunny," Posey said in a clear little child's voice, and Delaney went still when she heard the man pause, then bend down again, pick up the worn stuffed animal the little girl carried everywhere, and place it back into those small arms without another word. A new set of footsteps approached from behind, firm and measured, and another man's voice rose, low and calm, carrying the caution of someone long used to anticipating every possible outcome. "Boss, the local police will be here in 4 minutes. We should go," the man said, and Delaney understood at once that he was the only one in the crowd who dared remind the crime lord of anything, the only one whose voice held no trace of fear, only cold, clear-headed loyalty. "Sully, bring the car to the south entrance," Rourke replied, and that name was spoken with a trust Delaney could clearly feel, entirely different from the way he commanded the others. She clutched the cane as if it were the last plank of wood between her and a black ocean, stammering that she only wanted to go home, that she didn't know who he was, and didn't want to know, that her daughter needed to go home right now. But he placed one broad, warm hand against her back, not gripping, not forcing, only a steady weight guiding her forward, and his voice dropped low enough for her alone to hear, as he told her that outside there were people many times more dangerous than he was looking for her. And if she walked out that door alone tonight, he couldn't promise her daughter would be safe. Delaney went rigid, because there was no threat in his voice, and it was that naked honesty that frightened her more than the guns from moments before. She couldn't see the path ahead, couldn't see the stunned faces of the crowd parting to either side, couldn't see Sully walking close behind them like a silent wall, but she felt it all through the shifting sounds, through the rush of cold air when the door opened, and through the even breathing of Posey as she rested her head against her mother's shoulder, strangely enough no longer trembling, as if the little girl believed that the hand resting on her mother's back wouldn't let go. The car glided almost silently through the rain-slick streets of Chicago, and Delaney sat motionless in the back seat, holding Posey in her lap, counting each turn by the way her body tilted, trying to memorize a route she knew she would never be able to retrace. She heard the tires change their sound as they left the public asphalt and turned onto a private stone-paved drive, heard a heavy gate slide open and then close behind them with a low, hollow boom like the door of a vault, and in that very instant, she understood that she had entered an entirely different world. When Sully opened the car door, a rush of air swept toward her, carrying the scent of polished granite, of fresh flowers arranged in large vases, of something expensive and sterile that she had only ever caught in passing in the lobbies of hotels she could never afford to enter. Her foot tapped lightly against the floor, and the echo came back from walls so high she guessed the ceiling had to be more than 30 feet above her head, a space so vast it turned cold inside her, so silent that the sound of her own breathing seemed painfully clear. "This is the safest place in the city," Rourke said, his voice moving ahead of her like a guide, and Delaney thought to herself that safe and warm were two entirely different things, because this place felt as cold as a guarded museum, beautiful and deadly, without a single trace of real life. Posey, however, didn't think the way her mother did. The little girl slipped out of Delaney's arms before she could stop her, small feet pattering across the stone floor, and Delaney called her name in panic, imagining sharp edges everywhere, imagining every invisible danger in the room she couldn't see. But Posey's giggle rang out bright and clear, and the child cried that there was a really, really big staircase and a stone lion. And then Delaney heard the thing that made her heart tighten, the heavy footsteps of Roark following after the little girl, slow and careful, as if the man who had made an entire hall hold its breath was now cautious in the presence of a 4-year-old child. "What's the lion's name?" Posey asked, and there was a long silence before Roark answered that it didn't have a name yet, that she could give it one if she wanted. Delaney stood rooted in the middle of that enormous room, one hand gripping the icy back of a chair, listening to her daughter speak so freely with the most dangerous man in Chicago, as though he were some gentle uncle, and she couldn't understand why the child wasn't afraid at all, while every cell in her own body was trembling. What she couldn't see was the way Roark stood there, looking down at Posey, looking into the little girl's pale gray eyes as they lifted toward him with complete trust, the eyes he had recognized from the very first moment in the hall, the eyes that made something inside his chest ache in a way he had long ago forgotten, could still exist. An older housekeeper named Bertie was called in, her voice warm and practical, and for the first time since entering that place, Delaney felt herself able to let out a breath, because the woman's voice carried the ordinary steadiness she was craving with almost desperate need. Bertie led mother and daughter upstairs to a room on the upper floor, saying warm milk and a wide bed had already been prepared, and when Delaney quietly asked whether they could leave in the morning, the woman was silent for a moment, before answering that she should rest first, a reply that wasn't yes and wasn't no. That night, after Posey had fallen deeply asleep with her stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her arms, Delaney sat on the edge of the bed, in the darkness that had always been her familiar world, listening to the giant house breathe its strange breaths around her, the wind slipping through tall window frames, the steady footsteps of someone patrolling the grounds below. And she wondered what she had fallen into, why a stranger knew her name, and why, somewhere deep beneath the fear, she felt for the first time in many years that someone was standing between her and the darkness outside. While Delaney sat sleepless upstairs, Rourke stood alone in the dark study, a glass of liquor in his hand that hadn't yet touched his lips, the city lights spilling through the tall panes of glass and laying cold streaks across his face, and for the first time in many years, he allowed memory to drag him back to the night when he should have died. 12 years earlier, he had been only 25, still a vicious young wolf who hadn't yet inherited the throne, and a bloody settling of accounts had left him collapsed in the alley behind a hospital on the north side of the city. A bullet buried deep beneath his ribs, warm blood pouring out and soaking through his shirt, and he had lain there waiting to die with the cold calm of a man who had never been taught that his life was worth anything. The one who found him wasn't one of his own men, wasn't an enemy, but a middle-aged man in a white coat coming out through the back door, a forensic doctor who had just finished a late shift, and by every ordinary rule of reason, that man should have called the police and turned his back. But Walter Marsh didn't do that. Rourke still remembered it with brutal clarity, the way the man knelt down on the filthy alley pavement without a tremor in his hands, pressed his own coat hard against the wound, asked if Rourke could still hear him, and called to him in the strangely steady voice of someone who faced death every day and still hadn't lost his compassion. Walter brought him inside through the staff entrance, stitched the wound in an empty room, drew the bullet out with steady hands, and through all of it he didn't ask who Rourke was, didn't ask why he had been shot, didn't ask which side he belonged to in this blood-soaked city. When Rourke was finally conscious enough to ask why the man had saved someone who was clearly part of the underworld, Walter only looked at him for a long moment, then said the sentence Rourke would carry with him for 12 years, that he hadn't saved a criminal or a crime lord, he had simply saved a bleeding human being, and that every human being, no matter what they had done, deserved the chance to choose to become something better. And then Walter kept silent. Not one statement to the authorities, not one call to the police, not once did he try to use the fact that he knew the face and name of the heir to a criminal empire, even though that information alone would have been enough for another man to bargain his way into a fortune. In the world where Rourke had grown up, where every favor was a chain, and every act of kindness hid a blade, Walter's unconditional silence was the most incomprehensible thing he had ever encountered, and precisely because he couldn't understand it, he had never been able to forget it. He had once had men quietly watch Walter from a distance, repaying him in silent ways the man would never know about, and he had told himself that one day he would repay that debt properly. But he had been too late. 6 years ago, Walter Marsh was killed, a death staged so skillfully that on paper it looked like nothing more than a tragic accident, and by the time the news reached Rourke, the only benefactor of his life was already buried deep beneath the ground. He had searched for 6 years, not for revenge in the ordinary sense, but because of a gnawing obsession that never let him rest, the feeling of an unpaid debt hanging over his head like a sentence. And now, after all that time, fate had placed Walter's daughter and granddaughter into his hands, the child carrying the very same gray eyes as her grandfather, 2 fragile souls sleeping beneath his roof, without knowing that their late father and grandfather was the reason the hardened heart of the city's most ruthless crime lord was still beating. And Rourke stood there in the darkness, knowing that this time he wouldn't let himself arrive too late again. The next morning, Delaney woke with the firm resolve to leave that place, and she followed the cold wall downstairs, testing each broad stair with the tip of her cane, leaving Posey in Bertie's arms with a soft instruction to sit still and be good while she ate breakfast. She found Rourke in the vast dining room by the scent of coffee and the faint sound of pages turning, and she stood straight at the threshold, asking him plainly who he was, what he did, and why his men had drawn guns in the middle of a crowded shopping mall the night before, without anyone daring to say a word. There was a silence, and then he answered without evasion, without dressing it up, saying that he ran much of what happened in the shadows of this city, and that the name Castellane frightened people for reasons she shouldn't want to know too clearly. Delaney had guessed as much the night before, but hearing him admit it himself in a voice as calm as if he were speaking about the weather still sent a coldness down her spine, and she tightened her grip on the cane, asking next whether anyone had been hurt because of him last night, whether the smell she had caught on his coat, that sharp metallic scent she couldn't mistake because she was a nurse, had been blood. He didn't answer, and that silence was the clearest answer of all. She stepped forward, following the sound of his breathing, and when she was close enough to feel the warmth coming from his body, she lifted her blind face toward his and said she didn't care how powerful he was, how rich he was, that she had lived her whole life decently despite being poor, and she wouldn't let her daughter grow up in a house where people drew guns as easily as they drew handkerchiefs, where another person's blood clung to a man's coat like a familiar scent. He said that the little girl would be safe there, and that was when the anger she had held down all night broke open inside her, because the word safe coming from the mouth of a killer sounded like blasphemy. She swung her hand up, and although she couldn't see, an instinct sharpened by years of living in darkness guided her palm straight across his cheek with a crisp slap that cracked through the silent room. The whole space seemed to freeze. Bertie stood breathless in the doorway, and somewhere behind Delaney, she sensed Sully's sudden tension, the loyal man who surely had never seen anyone dare touch his boss that way. But Rourke didn't move. He didn't catch her wrist, didn't shout, didn't show even the smallest sign of the fury that terrified this entire city. He only stood there and took the slap. And Delaney heard him release a breath so quiet it was almost relief, as though that pain was something he believed he deserved. She stood trembling, her palm burning, half expecting some terrible consequence, but the only thing that came to her was his voice, low and strangely gentle, saying that she had every right to be angry, that she was right about all of it. She didn't want his agreement. She wanted freedom, and she told him plainly that she would rather return to her cramped apartment that smelled of damp walls, would rather count every spare coin until the end of the month than let her daughter eat breakfast in a castle built on other people's fear, that dignity was the only thing she had left and she wouldn't sell it for any price. Rourke was silent for a long while, then said he wouldn't keep her like a prisoner, that she could leave whenever she wanted, but before she walked out that door, he was asking her for only 5 minutes to listen to something about her father, something she had never been told all these years, and it was the name of her late father that stopped Delaney's feet just as she was about to walk away, leaving her frozen in the middle of that cold room. The story he told that morning kept Delaney there for a few more days, not because she believed him, but because the name of her late father was the only thread tying her to a past she had never fully understood, and during those uncertain days, small things began to slip in, quietly cracking the wall of suspicion she had built around herself. On the third afternoon, her old phone vibrated with a message from the hospital, where the medical debt that had hung over her for 4 years still remained, and the screen reader software for the visually impaired read out in its emotionless machine voice that her entire balance had been paid, with not 1 penny left owing. Delaney stood frozen in the hallway, her hand gripping the phone, and instead of relief, she felt a cold anger rise inside her, because she knew exactly who had done this without asking her a single word. She went looking for Roark, this time without slapping him, without shouting, only setting the phone down on the table in front of him and saying in a voice trembling with restraint that he had no right, that the debt was hers, her burden, the thing she had carried on her back for 4 years with her own sweat, and that erasing it with a single phone call didn't make her grateful. It only made her feel small. Rourke listened in silence until she had finished, then said he hadn't done it so she would owe him anything, that to him the money was nothing, but to her it had been all those sleepless nights, and he couldn't bear the thought that something as small as money could weigh so heavily on the shoulders of someone who had already carried too much. She didn't know how to answer an explanation so arrogant and so tender at the same time, so she only said that next time he had to ask her first, anything that had to do with her life. And strangely, he nodded at once, as though it were a fair term, but it was the second moment that truly melted a sheet of ice inside her. One morning, Delaney followed the sound of her daughter's voice and stopped at the threshold of the living room, where Posey was sitting with crayons and sheets of paper spread across the floor, asking Rourke a question that would make any adult uneasy. What blue looked like. Delaney held her breath and waited, accustomed to people avoiding such questions, or giving some careless answer just to move past them. But Rourke, the man the whole city feared, sat down on the floor beside the child, and began to say that blue was the cool feeling of lake water in summer when she dipped her feet into it, the sound of wind moving through tall trees in the park, the first deep breath she took when she stepped outside after rain. He said yellow was the warmth of sunlight resting on the back of her hand, the sweetness of honey melting on the tip of her tongue, and red was the quick, bright pounding she felt in her chest when she ran very fast and laughed very loud. Posy listened in wonder, then cried out that in that case, she would color the lion with the color of laughter, and Delaney stood there at the doorway, one hand clinging to the cold frame, tears quietly rising to the corners of her blind eyes. For 4 years, she had described the whole world to her daughter in exactly that way, had turned darkness into a place that could be touched and felt, and she had never thought there would come a day when she would hear someone else do that for her little girl, much less that the person doing it would be a killer. She didn't step inside. She only stood there in silence, listening to her daughter laugh, and to Rourke's deep voice patiently answer one innocent question after another. And for the first time, since setting foot inside this cold house, she wondered whether, beneath all that thick ice, somewhere, there was still something left in him that knew how to be warm. That night, lying on the strange wide bed with Posy sleeping deeply beside her, Delaney let memory carry her back to the years she still tried not to think about, because every time she touched them, the old wound began to bleed again. 4 years earlier, she had still been a woman who could see the world, a capable emergency room nurse with steady hands and a future spread out before her, carrying her first child beneath her heart, and believing she had everything a person could hope for. Then came that fateful night, the night her memory held only in broken pieces, the blinding glare of headlights rushing toward her from the side, the shriek of metal grinding into metal, and then darkness, a darkness that never lifted again. When she woke in the hospital, the doctors told her in gentle, pitying voices that the optic nerve damage was permanent, that she would never see again, and the strange thing was that even inside all that despair, she still felt something about that night didn't fit, a vague question circling her mind that she could never quite piece together, about how the other car had appeared with such strange speed and precision, but she had been too exhausted then to chase after invisible doubts. Her husband, the man who had once sworn to stay beside her in sickness and in health, lasted exactly 3 weeks. She still remembered the day he stood at the foot of her hospital bed, his voice cold as he said he hadn't signed on to care for a blind woman for the rest of his life, that this wasn't the life he had imagined, and then he walked out the door, leaving her with a belly swollen near birth and a world that had gone completely dark. She gave birth to Posy alone, learned how to change diapers, mix bottles, and soothe her child to sleep entirely with her hands and ears, turning the cramped apartment on the south side into a map she knew by heart, down to every corner and edge. And every night she told herself that as long as the little girl was safe, she could still remain standing. The only person who kept her from the edge of the abyss during those years was her father, Walter, though by then he was gone too, because he had died 2 years before she lost the light, but what he had left inside her was still alive. She remembered her father as a quiet man with warm hands and a strange calmness, a man who came home after long shifts and still sat beside her every evening, telling her stories, reading her poems he had made up himself, teaching her that the worth of a human being wasn't measured by what they owned, but by how they treated those weaker than themselves. There were nights when he held her hand and made her repeat strange chains of rhymes after him, words with no clear meaning at all, saying it was a memory game that belonged only to the two of them, and the little girl she had been had obediently learned every line by heart, without ever knowing why, simply because she loved her father, and loved the way his deep, warm voice filled the dark room. Now, lying in the house of a strange man who had spoken her father's name with a kind of respect she couldn't understand, Delaney pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat steadily in the dark, and for the first time in many years, she allowed that old question to rise again. Why a gentle forensic doctor like her father had died in an accident, and why she herself, 2 years later, had nearly lost her life in another accident, and whether between those two darknesses there was a thread she hadn't dared look at directly for the past 4 years. While Delaney lay awake upstairs with old questions circling through her mind, Rourke sat in the study with Sully, the files he had quietly gathered over 6 years spread out before them, and for the first time, he allowed his loyal associate to see the whole picture he had assembled, one piece at a time. Walter Marsh's death had never been an accident. Rourke had known that for a long time, but the thing that had tormented him through all those years was the question of why a gentle forensic doctor had become a target who needed to be erased, and now the final pieces were slowly revealing a truth darker than he had imagined. In the last years of his life, Walter had accidentally examined a body that was supposed to be ruled a suicide, but his sharp professional eyes had seen marks that didn't fit, and when he quietly dug deeper, he discovered that the death was an execution staged to silence a witness. That thread led to Thorne Beckett, a rival crime lord notorious for his cruelty, a man considered bottomless in his ruthlessness even within the underworld. But Beckett was only half the problem, because what Walter uncovered didn't stop with one criminal. It climbed higher, reaching beyond the shadows of alleys and warehouses, touching a name the entire city was looking up to with respect. Hollis Vane, the ambitious young prosecutor on his way to becoming the brightest political star in the state, the man the press praised as a symbol of justice and integrity. Rourke told Sully in a low, cold voice that this was the real reason Walter's evidence had become valuable enough for people to kill in order to bury it, because it didn't merely expose a crime lord. It laid bare the network of dirty money flowing underground from Beckett's empire straight into the pockets of a man wearing the mantle of justice. A man who held the power to prosecute or absolve anyone in this city. Sully let out a soft breath, understanding at once that this was no longer an ordinary gang war, but something far more dangerous, a force that had sunk its roots deep into the very machinery that was supposed to protect the people, an enemy who could order murder in the dark and smile for the cameras in daylight. Rourke explained that this was why he still hadn't been able to strike after 6 years. Because killing Beckett would be useless while the true head of the snake sat comfortably inside the prosecutor's office, shielded by the law, celebrated by public opinion, and one wrong move would turn Roark himself into the wanted man, while the real culprit kept rising. The only thing that could bring down a man like Vane wasn't a bullet, but the very evidence Walter had collected and hidden before he died, the material both Beckett and Vane had searched for over 6 years without finding, the thing they were certain Walter had left somewhere, and would never stop hunting until they had it in their hands. Rourke stood, walked to the tall glass window, and looked down at the city glittering with lights below, then said quietly, almost to himself, that Walter's daughter was now sleeping under his roof, and if those men caught the scent of that, they wouldn't only search for the evidence anymore. They would believe she was the key to finding it, and when that happened, both she and the child would become the most relentlessly hunted prey in the city. Sully asked whether she knew anything, and Rourke shook his head, saying he believed she had no idea at all what she might be holding, and that very innocence was both her shield and her most dangerous sentence, because the enemy would never believe anyone could be that innocent. A few nights later, a great blizzard came crashing down over Chicago, covering the city in a thick white blanket, and near midnight the whole neighborhood sank into darkness when the power grid collapsed beneath the weight of ice. For Delaney, the loss of electricity changed nothing, because darkness had long been her homeland. But she heard the quiet stir of unease spreading through the house, Bertie's voice soothing a sleepy Posey, the backup generator somewhere coughing a few times before falling silent, and she followed the familiar wall downstairs, strangely becoming the steadiest person in a house that had just been stripped of light. She found Rourke in the study by the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, and the warmth spreading through the cold air, and he seemed surprised to see her move swiftly through the pitch-black room, while the sighted people had to feel their way around. She sat down in the armchair across from him by the fire, and in the particular stillness that only a blizzard night could create, when the entire world outside had its sounds swallowed by snow, something between them softened enough for the truth to speak. She asked why a man like him had become the person he was now, and for the first time, Rourke didn't evade the question. He told her in a low, even voice that he had never been given a choice. The man who raised him, his father, hadn't taught him how to love or how to trust, but had forged him the way one forged a blade, forcing him from the time he was a child to witness things no child should ever see, teaching him that compassion was a crack an enemy would slip through. That feeling was a luxury, reserved only for those foolish enough to die young. He said that by 10 he had learned how not to cry. By 15 he had learned how to feel nothing at all, and when he finally inherited this empire, he had become exactly the weapon his father wanted, sharp, cold, and lonely to the very end of himself. Delaney listened, and in that calm, deep voice, she heard a loneliness so profound, it tightened her chest. A pain buried so carefully that even the man carrying it had forgotten it was still there. Without thinking, she set her cane aside and stood, feeling her way across the distance between them. and when her knees touched his chair, she whispered that she wanted to see him in the only way she could. Rourke sat motionless as her fingertips touched his face, and she read him through touch as if reading a page, tracing the stern lines of his cheekbones, the straight bridge of his nose, his brows, then stopping at a faint scar running along his temple that she guessed had been there for a very long time, and she felt him hold his breath beneath that gentle contact, felt the heavy beat of his pulse in his jaw, as if no one had ever touched him in a way that wasn't meant to cause pain or demand something in return. In that moment, the warmth from the fire, the nearness of their bodies, and the charged current between them became too dense, and Delaney felt herself leaning toward something she knew was more dangerous than any gun. But then her fingers drifted down to his collar and brushed against something that made her freeze, the cold grip of the handgun tucked at his side, a silent reminder of who this man was and what these hands had done. She pulled her hand back as if she had touched fire, stepped away, and her voice trembled as she said she was sorry, that she couldn't, that no matter what good thing might still remain inside him, she still couldn't give her heart to a hand that carried the smell of blood. Not because of him, but because of her daughter, because of the person she still wanted to be. Rourke didn't hold her back. He only sat there in the flickering firelight. And as she felt her way out of the room, he said softly after her that she was right, that she deserved something cleaner than him, and it was the quiet surrender in his voice that made her tears fall in the dark the entire way back to her room. A few miles away, inside a shuttered bar on the far west edge of the city, Garrett Voss sat across from someone he should never have been allowed to meet, and cigarette smoke curled between them like a poisonous oath, being sealed in the dark. Garrett had served under Rourke for nearly 10 years, as his lieutenant, as the hand the crime lord still trusted with his most important operations, and through all those years he had waited patiently, swallowing every slow, burning flare of envy each time he had to bow his head before a man he believed was no better than himself. But what finally made Garrett decide to act wasn't only old ambition. It was what he had witnessed over the past few weeks, the image of a Rourke Castellane he no longer recognized, a crime lord who had once ordered an entire warehouse burned to the ground without blinking, now sitting on the floor describing colors to a child, a cold-blooded predator, now letting a blind woman slap him across the face without striking back. To Garrett, that wasn't mercy. It was weakness, the sign of an alpha wolf that had lost its fangs, and in the world where he had grown up, a soft leader was a leader who deserved to be replaced. The man sitting across from him belonged to Beckett, and the offer placed on the table was perfectly clear. If Garrett helped Beckett get what he needed, then all of Castellane's territory would belong to him. The throne he had coveted for an entire decade would finally be his. And in exchange, he only had to do one thing: find out the connection between Rourke and the blind woman who had recently appeared, and confirm whether she was the key to the thing Beckett had been hunting for. Garrett smiled in the darkness, because he had already connected more pieces than the other man realized. He had noticed the way Rourke had changed since the night at the shopping mall, had seen his boss double the usual guard around the house, had overheard the name Marsh whispered behind closed doors, and though he didn't yet know the whole story, he knew one thing for certain: that the woman mattered to Rourke in a way no one had ever mattered before. And anything that mattered to a crime lord was also a fatal weakness that could be used for bargaining. He told Beckett's man that he needed time, that touching a single hair on her head while she was still inside the heavily guarded mansion would be no different from suicide, but he would find a way to draw Rourke out of his den, create a gap wide enough to strike without leaving any trace pointing back to himself. In Garrett's mind, the plan had already begun to take shape, a diversion attack in another district serious enough to force Rourke to appear in person, taking his best gunmen with him, leaving the house with a layer of defense far thinner than it looked from the outside. He lifted his glass, took a sip, and told himself that loyalty was only a commodity like everything else, that it had its price, and the price Beckett was paying was high enough for him to betray the man who had trusted him for nearly 10 years. What Garrett never expected, as he stepped out into the snow-covered night with the smug smile of a man who believed he had calculated every move, was that the blind woman he saw as a fragile pawn on the board was carrying inside her own memory a weapon that no one, not even she herself, knew existed. 2 days later, just as the snow had finally eased, Garrett's plan began to move exactly as he had arranged it. In the early evening, Rourke's phone rang with word that one of his most important warehouses in Pilsen had just been attacked, that shots had been fired, people had been wounded, and the situation was spinning beyond control. and needed him there in person before it dragged them into an all-out war. Rourke frowned, because something about the report didn't fit with what he understood of the current balance of power. But the Pilsen warehouse was too vital a link to abandon, and Garrett, standing right beside him, urged him to leave at once with the convincing urgency of a devoted lieutenant. Rourke ordered his best gunmen assembled, told Sully to come with him, and before leaving the mansion, he stopped at the foot of the stairs, lifted his gaze toward the upper floor where Delaney and Posey were staying, instructed the gate guards to tighten security, then stepped out into the night with a vague instinct that something was wrong, something he hadn't yet had time to name. Garrett got into a car and went with the convoy, playing the role of a loyal subordinate to perfection. But halfway there he made an excuse to split off and check another route, and the moment Rourke's line of cars disappeared from sight, he turned back, bringing with him several men he had already bought. On the second floor, Delaney startled awake from a shallow, uneasy sleep because of a feeling she couldn't explain. That sixth sense sharpened through years of living in darkness, when her ears and skin had been forced to do the work of the eyes she had lost. She realized the house had changed the rhythm of its breathing, the familiar patrol steps outside growing fewer and then falling silent, the sudden absence where there should have been the steady sounds of guards moving through the grounds, and a mother's instinct rose inside her before reason could even understand what was happening. She climbed out of bed, woke Bertie in the room next door, and in a soft but firm voice said that something was wrong, that the woman had to take Posey away immediately. Bertie, who had lived in that house long enough to know that the fear of a blind woman was often more accurate than the reassurance of those who could see, didn't ask a single question. The two women quickly lifted Posey, still drowsy, out of bed, the little girl clutching her stuffed bunny close and rubbing her eyes as she asked where they were going, and Delaney bent down to whisper into her daughter's ear, in the gentlest voice she could gather, that this was only a game of hide-and-seek, that she had to go with Bertie to a very warm, secret room, and sit there like a good girl until her mother came to get her. Bertie led the child along a passage Delaney had quietly memorized during her first days there, down to a fortified room beneath the basement with a thick steel door that Sully had once mentioned as the safest refuge in the house. And Delaney stood at the top of the stairs listening to her daughter's small footsteps fading farther and farther away, listening until the steel door closed with a heavy, solid lock, and only when she knew for certain that her child was behind that layer of steel, safe and unable to hear anything that was about to happen, did she turn back to face the darkness of the house, where unfamiliar footsteps were now entering. Slow, deliberate, and drawing closer with every passing moment, Delaney felt her way downstairs. Every footstep a calculation, the tip of her cane testing the stone floor softly so it wouldn't make a sound, and she stopped in the middle of the vast living room when she heard familiar footsteps entering from the hallway, a gate she had memorized during her days in this house, the gate of the lieutenant named Garrett. She asked why he was still there when he was supposed to have gone with Rourke, and his soft laugh sounded in the darkness, a cold sound that had completely stripped away the respectful mask he always wore in front of his boss. He said that at last it was only the two of them, that she shouldn't waste her strength calling for help because the loyal guards had all been sent elsewhere tonight, and Delaney sensed him circling her slowly like an animal toying with its prey. His breath, the smell of cigarettes and liquor clinging to him, the distance between them shrinking with every turn. He told her that he knew she was Walter Marsh's daughter, that he knew Rourke had hidden her here as though hiding a treasure, and that he needed her to tell him one thing, where her father had hidden those documents. Delaney answered honestly that she didn't understand what he was talking about, that her father had only been a gentle forensic doctor who had died 6 years ago, but Garrett didn't believe her, and his voice sharpened as he said he didn't have time for this innocent act. He seized her arm, his fingers tightening hard enough to hurt, dragging her closer, and to break her will, he began saying the things he thought would make her collapse in fear, but instead, he tore open a truth she had buried for 4 years. He gave a faint, contemptuous laugh and said she still thought the night she lost her eyes was an accident, asked whether she was really that naive, said the car that slammed into her that night hadn't appeared by chance. It had been sent, driven by one of Beckett's people, because by then they suspected Walter had left something behind for her, and they wanted to threaten her, warn her, force her to reveal whatever she knew. Delaney stood frozen, the whole world seeming to collapse and rebuild itself in the same instant. 4 years of vague questions she had never dared look at directly, now flaring into a truth so naked it was cruel. Her sight hadn't been lost to chance. It had been stolen from her with purpose, by the very people who had killed her father. And Garrett, drunk on the feeling of power, added the final nail, saying that Walter's death had never been an accident either, that her gentle father had been eliminated because he knew too much, because he had dared trace things powerful men wanted buried forever. A tremor ran through Delaney's body, but strangely, in the middle of the storm roaring inside her chest, something else began to rise too, cold and clear. Not fear, but a silent rage so still it was almost terrifying. Her father had died protecting something, had borne his gentleness all the way to the end, and these people had stolen his life, stolen her light, and nearly stolen her daughter's future too. In that instant, as Garrett tightened his grip on her arm and demanded through clenched teeth that she tell him immediately if she didn't want to suffer the consequences, Delaney stopped trembling, her breathing slowed, and in some deep place inside her memory, the strange rhymes her father had made her memorize all those years ago, those meaningless strings of sound she had always believed were only a private game between father and daughter, suddenly rang through her mind with chilling clarity. And for the first time in all those years, she began to understand what they truly were. In the instant the old rhymes rang through her mind, Delaney suddenly understood everything, that the strings of sound that had seemed meaningless, the ones her father had patiently made her memorize during those dark nights when she was much older, hadn't been a childhood memory game at all, but something he had deliberately entrusted to the safest place in the world, the mind of his daughter. Those verses were numbers disguised as words, sequences of codes hidden inside rhythm, a map leading to the truth he had known he wouldn't live long enough to reveal, and he had chosen her as its keeper, because he believed no enemy would ever think to search a person's memory. Walter had never hidden the evidence in a safe, a room, or a piece of paper that could be found and burned. He had hidden it inside her, and for 6 years she had carried the very thing the entire underworld had been hunting without knowing it. But that realization flashed through her for only a fraction of a second, because right now Garrett's hand was still clamped around her arm, his voice still grinding out demands for an answer, and Delaney knew that if she let even the smallest sign show that she had understood, he would never let her live. She wasn't an assassin, she had never held a weapon, but she was an emergency room nurse, and for many years before darkness had fallen over her, her hands had known the human body by heart, every tendon, every cluster of nerves, every place where the right pressure could bring even a large man to his knees. She let her body go soft, let her voice break into false sobs, stammering that she would talk, that he please shouldn't hurt her. And she felt triumph loosen his grip, felt arrogance make him lower his guard exactly as she had counted on. She leaned slightly toward him like someone surrendering, and all her senses narrowed to the work of locating him, listening to his breathing to know where his head was, feeling the heat of his body to draw in the darkness, the precise map her eyes could no longer give her. Then she struck, fast and decisive, the heel of her hand snapping upward into the nerve point just beneath his jaw, with all the strength born from 4 years of buried rage, a blow that didn't require brute force, only absolute accuracy, landing exactly where it made his whole world flare white and his knees buckle. Garrett staggered and released her, a growl of pain and shock ripping out of his throat, and before he could gather himself, Delaney seized her cane, not as a weapon meant to kill, but to create distance, bringing it down hard behind his knee at the exact point that made his leg collapse, then turning out of his reach with the quickness of someone who had lived her life in darkness and knew how to move through it better than anyone with sight. He crashed onto the stone floor, dazed, one hand clutching his neck as he tried to scramble up and draw his gun. But his numb fingers were clumsy and fumbling, and Delaney, standing firm in the very darkness that was her homeland, retreated toward the wall she had memorized, her heart pounding like a war drum, while her mind stayed cold and bright. She wasn't the weak prey he had imagined. She was the daughter of a man who had foreseen his own death, and had quietly armed his child with things more precious than sight, memory, courage, and a calm forged in the work of saving lives. And in that life-or-death moment, the blind mother stood with her spine straight, not because she wasn't afraid, but because behind her, beyond the steel door in the basement, a small life was waiting for her to come back. Meanwhile, on the road to Pilsen, the uneasy instinct inside Roark had hardened into a chilling certainty when he realized the attack was too clean, too perfectly timed, a trap carefully built to draw him away, and when he turned to look for Garrett, he discovered that his lieutenant had vanished from the convoy, without him noticing when. In that same moment, another piece also dropped into place in his mind, because only a few people inside the organization knew about the secret plan he had been quietly carrying out for months. The plan to contact a trustworthy federal agent, so that one day Walter's evidence could be brought into the light through the proper path of the law, and the only person he had ever entrusted with building that bridge was Sully. For one dark instant, suspicion slid into Roark's heart like a knife. The thought that perhaps his most trusted associate had sold him out, that the traitor wasn't Garrett but the quiet man who had sat beside him for all those years. But Sully, as if he could read the struggle on his boss's face, only said in his familiar, calm voice that he had never betrayed Roark for a single day, that the meeting with the federal agent the night before had been carried out exactly according to Roark's own unspoken order, and that if Roark still doubted him, he could shoot him right there. But first he needed to turn the cars around because the house was in danger. It was that fearlessly steady calm that swept every doubt away, and Roark shouted the order for the entire convoy to turn back, racing toward the mansion at a wild speed through the snow-covered streets. When the cars roared through the gates, Roark was the first to jump out, gun already in his hand, and Sully stayed close behind him, just as he had done for nearly 10 years. They stormed into the pitch-black house, and while Roark was still following the sounds to find his bearings, a figure hiding in a dark corner, one of the men Garrett had bought and left behind to block the way, raised a gun and aimed straight at Roark from an angle he couldn't see. Sully saw it first, and without a second of hesitation, that quiet man lunged forward and shoved his boss aside just as the gunshot tore through the silence, and the bullet meant for Roark buried itself in Sully's chest. Roark brought the shooter down in an instant, then dropped to his knees beside his collapsing associate, both hands pressing hard against the wound, spilling blood, calling his name in a voice he didn't recognize as his own, a voice broken by an emotion this cold man had believed he'd lost long ago. Sully looked up at his boss, the corner of his mouth lifting into a tired smile, and whispered that he had told him so, that he had never betrayed him, and that his job had always been to stand between Roark and harm, today no different from any other day. Roark roared for someone to call an ambulance, pressing down on the wound with everything he had, begging for the first time in his life for something money and power couldn't buy, that Sully had to keep breathing, that he wasn't allowed to die because of a bullet that should have belonged to Roark. And while he knelt there in darkness and blood, holding on to the life of the one man who had never betrayed him, he suddenly heard from deep inside the house the sound of another man groaning on the stone floor, and his head snapped up, realizing that somewhere farther within, Delaney was facing the man who had trapped them all by herself. Leaving one of his men behind to press down on Sully's wound and wait for the ambulance, Roark charged deeper into the house, following the sounds echoing from the living room, and the scene that met his eyes when he burst across the threshold carved itself into his memory forever. Garrett was on his knees on the stone floor, one hand clutching his jaw, the other shaking as he reached blindly for the gun that had skidded somewhere into the darkness. The face of the lieutenant, who had once been so full of smug confidence, now twisted with pain and disbelief, soaked terror, and standing a few steps away from him, her back braced firmly against the wall, her white cane gripped in her hand like a sword, was Delaney. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't begged. She stood there inside the very darkness that was her kingdom, her blind face lifted high, her breathing ragged but her posture steady as stone. A woman who had just taken down, all by herself, the man his entire organization had known to be wary of. Roark froze at the threshold for one moment, and everything about the way he had seen her turned upside down completely, because through all these past weeks he had thought of her as something fragile that needed protecting, a candle he had to shield from the wind with his own body, and now he realized how badly he had been mistaken. This woman wasn't a candle. She was steel-tempered in darkness, Walter Marsh's true daughter in a way far deeper than blood. Garrett, hearing his boss's footsteps, looked up with the last shred of desperate hope, stammering something about how the woman had gone mad, how she had attacked him for no reason. But Roark didn't bother listening. He crossed the room in only a few strides, and struck him with a blow that sent him crashing fully to the floor, then pinned him down with one knee, stripped him of his weapon, and clenched his collar in a rage as cold as ice. He leaned close to Garrett's face, and said in a voice so low it was almost terrifying that he had betrayed nearly 10 years of trust, had brought the enemy into his house, had dared touch the woman and child under his protection, and that he would pay for every single thing. But just as his fingers tightened, some cold part of his reason stopped him in time, because Garrett alive still had value. He was the living thread that led straight to Beckett, the only man who could reveal the whole plan and the names behind it, and a corpse couldn't confess to anything. Roark loosened his grip, ordered the two men who had just rushed in to tie Garrett up tightly and take him down to the basement under guard, far away from the place where the child was sheltering, and only after Garrett had been dragged off, his groans fading into the distance, did Roark turn back to Delaney. He approached her slowly, so she could hear every step he took, unwilling to startle her after everything she had just endured. And when he stood before her, he saw that her hands were still gripping the cane so hard her knuckles had gone pale, her whole body trembling faintly now that the danger had passed and the fear she had forced down was finally allowed to rise. He softly called her name, his voice carrying a tenderness and a respect he had never heard in himself before. And he told her she was safe now, that he had come back. Delaney turned her face toward the sound of his voice, and instead of asking about herself, the first question that broke from her lips was whether her daughter was safe, and that question, placing her child above even her own terror, made something inside Roark's chest break open into an emotion he could no longer deny. Roark hurried Delaney down to the basement, and when the heavy steel door was opened, Birdie rose with her face drained white from worry, holding Posey in her arms as the little girl went limp, and she said in panic that the child had suddenly grown burning hot all over, and then begun to convulse. Delaney rushed forward, the hands of a mother and a nurse waking at the same time, and the instant her palm pressed against her daughter's forehead, she knew how serious it was. The child's skin was scorching like coal, her small body stiffening and jerking in waves inside her mother's arms. She asked sharply when it had started, and inside her mind, the emergency room nurse she had once been immediately rose up, sweeping aside the terror of the mother to make room for the cold clarity that had once saved countless lives. She recognized it as a seizure brought on by a high fever, something she had handled dozens of times in the years when she still stood in the emergency room. But the blizzard outside had sealed off every road. The ambulance reported that it would take at least 40 minutes to arrive, and the nearest hospital was farther away than anything this child could afford to wait for. Roark, the man who had just brought down a traitor without flinching, now stood there utterly helpless, his face going pale as he watched the little girl convulse in her mother's arms, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city turned to Delaney and did something he had never done with anyone. He begged, his voice breaking, asking what he had to do, saying he would do anything, that she only needed to give the order. And Delaney, in that moment, became the one in command, her voice clear and decisive as she ordered him to place the child on her side on a flat surface so her airway would stay open, told Birdie to bring cool water, not cold water, and towels, guiding each person one by one with the absolute calm of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She told Roark to remove the thick layers of clothing from the little girl so her body could release heat, placed cool towels on her forehead, her neck, under both arms, and at her groin where the blood vessels ran closest to the skin, and she pressed her ear to her daughter's chest to listen to her breathing, her fingers settling against the tiny wrist to count each pulse, her blind eyes needing no sight because her trained hands could read the child's entire condition. She kept her voice steady and gentle, whispering into the little girl's ear that Mommy was there, that she was going to be all right, both to comfort the child and to hold herself together, while Roark knelt beside her and obeyed every instruction with complete submission, the hands that had once pulled a trigger without blinking now trembling as he wrung out each cool towel, his eyes never leaving the face of the woman calmly fighting for her child's life in the middle of chaos. The minutes dragged on as if they would never end, and then slowly, Posey's convulsions eased. Her small body softened out of its rigid strain, her breathing became steadier, and when the little girl finally opened her eyes and called out Mommy in a weak but conscious voice, Delaney bowed her head beside her daughter, her shoulders shaking, and for the first time since the danger had begun, she allowed herself to cry. When the ambulance finally arrived after the storm and confirmed that the little girl had passed through the critical moment because she had been treated quickly and correctly, the medic looked at Delaney in astonishment and said it was her calm and her precise steps that had saved the child. Roark stood silently watching that blind woman, the woman who in a single night had brought down a killer and then saved her own daughter's life with nothing but her bare hands, and he understood that what he felt now wasn't only love, but a deep reverence before a kind of strength that his whole life in violence had never allowed him to witness. The strength of someone who healed. Garrett's confession in the basement led to the thing Roark had been waiting for across 6 long years, a place and a time. the meeting where Thorne Beckett would appear in person, to receive what he believed was finally within his reach. While Posey slept peacefully under Bertie's care in a safe room far from every danger, Rourke and his men set their trap inside an abandoned warehouse by the river, and Delaney insisted on going with them because she was the only one holding the thing everyone had been searching for, and she refused to stand outside the fight that had stolen her father and her sight. Beckett arrived with the arrogance of a man who believed every piece on the board was in his hand. But behind him stepped Hollis Vane, the corrupt prosecutor Rourke had been hunting for 6 long years, the true head of the snake who had hidden comfortably behind the cloak of justice. His chilling appearance confirmed that the corruption reached far beyond the shadows, straight into the machinery meant to protect the people. When the confrontation reached its breaking point, and guns were drawn on both sides, Rourke managed to get close to Beckett, and in that instant, he stood there with his gun aimed straight at the head of the man who had killed Walter, the man who had ordered Delaney's sight stolen from her, the man at the source of every sorrow, and every fiber of the old self inside him screamed for him to pull the trigger. But Delaney, following the voices and the breaths to find her way, stepped up beside him and placed her hand on his raised arm, her voice ringing out through the unbearable tension as she said that if he pulled the trigger, Beckett would die like a martyr in the dark. The truth would be buried with him, and Vane would go on smiling before the cameras, while Rourke would become exactly what his father had forged him to be, a killer, and her daughter would grow up calling a killer family. She said her father hadn't chosen revenge. He had chosen the truth, had quietly gathered evidence and entrusted it to the safest place so that one day justice could be done the right way, and she wouldn't betray the choice he had made. Just then, according to the plan Sully had built the bridge for, and Rourke had secretly prepared, federal agents stormed the warehouse from every side, floodlights flaring, orders ringing out with hard authority, and Delaney, standing in the middle of that encirclement, began to recite clearly, verse by verse, the numbers and names encoded inside the lullaby her father had carved into her memory long ago, a living testimony no flame could ever destroy, exposing the entire network of dirty money flowing from Beckett's empire into Vane's pockets. Rourke listened to every word she spoke and slowly lowered the gun, and in that moment of letting the weapon fall, he made the hardest choice of his life, the choice to trust a path he had never been taught could exist, the path Walter had chosen, the path of justice instead of blood. Beckett was handcuffed amid helpless roaring, while Vane stood frozen, realizing that what had brought him down wasn't a bullet, but the flawless memory of the blind woman he had completely underestimated. This undeniable evidence under the RICO Act laid the foundation for a historic trial in the light of day, sending both the ruthless crime lord and the corrupt prosecutor behind bars for the rest of their lives through the rightful weight of the law. For Rourke, that night in the warehouse was a turning point from which there was no going back, because when he lowered the gun and chose to believe in Walter's path, he also chose to leave behind the man he had once been, and that change didn't come overnight like a miracle. It became a long journey he walked day by day, undoing each link of the shadow empire he had inherited, moving whatever could be redeemed into the light, and letting go of everything that couldn't be saved. He used most of his fortune to establish a foundation named after Walter Marsh, dedicated to the children of victims of violence and to those in the city who had no voice, and along with it, a rehabilitation center for the visually impaired, a place where people, society had once seen as weak, were given back dignity and opportunity, exactly as Delaney's father had believed all his life, that a person's worth wasn't found in what they had lost, but in what they could still give. Sully survived the bullet he had taken for his boss, and when he recovered, the bond between the two men was no longer that of a crime lord and a subordinate, but of two human beings who had crossed the line between life and death together. Rourke found the finest surgeons in the country for Delaney, and they told her there was a possibility, not a certainty, that a complex operation might restore part of the vision she had lost, and though the outcome still lay ahead and no one dared promise anything, for Delaney, the most important thing wasn't whether she would ever see again, because she had already seen Rourke's true self more clearly than anyone who had ever had sight. She had touched the heart the whole world believed was dead, and awakened it with her own unwavering kindness. 1 year later, on Christmas itself, inside a house now warmed by laughter instead of the old coldness, Posey ran across the room with her worn, stuffed bunny still clutched tightly in her arms, and the little girl looked up and called Rourke by a word he had never dared dream he would hear, Papa. And the man who had once made an entire city tremble had to turn his face away to hide his reddened eyes. Delaney stepped to his side, placed her hand on his face in the way she had always seen him, and she smiled when she felt that he was smiling too. And he softly whispered her name, Marsh. But this time that name was no longer the name of a blood debt or a secret hunted in the dark. It had become the name of his family, the name of the home he had never thought a man like him could deserve. And the story of the blind, single mother who accidentally stepped into the life of a crime lord came to a close, not with blood or power, but with love, redemption, and the belief that no one, no matter how wounded or how lost, is beyond healing. This story sends us a simple yet profound message, that the true value of a person doesn't lie in strength, money, or an unbroken appearance, but in kindness, in the dignity we hold onto through hardship, and in the ability to see the good in others even when they themselves have forgotten it exists within them. That each of us deserves respect and the chance to become something better. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can hear many more moving stories every day, and we'd truly love to know how you feel about this story, what it reminds you of in your own real life, whether there is someone around you who has ever been underestimated simply because they were different or wounded. So please leave a comment and share the deepest feelings in your heart, because we're always listening. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to this moment. We wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.